After spending 3 years as a medal student at Syracuse University, Kristin came to OCAC, Oregon College of Art and Craft, as a continuing ed student in wood. But then she stepped into the medal studio and she could no longer control herself, and she immediately enrolled in the BFA program in medals. I got the pleasure of working with the most ambitious, enthusiastic, meticulous, organized, obsessive-compulsive medalsmith on the planet. She was one of those students that makes teaching, in all that us teachers go through, the most rewarding endeavor. As a student, she was an inspiration to all students. She won the prestigious Student Merit Award, and at the same year, she won the Karen Doshbach Award for her dedication to student community. And now she continues to inspire us all, including the Portland community. She was hired as the gallery director of Portland's Museum of Contemporary Crafts, but we stole her back. She's in January, she was hired as OCAC's Extension Program Director, where she oversees continuing education, the Artist in Residence program, our workshop program, the Kids and Seniors camps and workshops, and other various outreach programs. She's been asked to speak here today amongst a group of most impressive and prestigious metalsmiths, in my opinion, and all of yours, I'm sure. But as you'll agree, I feel like she fits amongst these people as appropriately here. 5 fingers on a hand. Please welcome Kristin Shiga.
Wow. Thank you for the incredibly generous introduction, Kristin. It is truly my honor to be here among my heroes on this stage today, so thank you so much for having me. When I was asked to speak here today, I was asked to speak about the unorthodox way that I've gone about both making a living in craft and getting my education in craft. And it got me thinking, what exactly is the normal way to go about doing that these days? I bet every single one of us in this whole auditorium, in our own way, lives the life of a tinker, which is how I think of myself, kind of going around through life, picking up little pieces that we find, and putting it together until it looks like something whole. When I was trying to, one of the things that I realized is that I am unorthodox in the sense that I never really chose one path. I kind of chose 3 and tried to do all 3 all at once, again, like some of you. And I realized I couldn't really remember all of the steps that it took to get me from point A to point B. So I then was thinking about how can I remember all of this? And I realized I had a really perfect tool at my disposal, although it's slightly embarrassing. I have saved almost every name tag I have worn in my adult life. Not like the sticky-backed ones, because that would be crazy. But, and don't laugh, because I know you all do it too. And what I found is that when you arrange them just right, it's really great to see where you've been, kind of where you are now, and again, if you place them perfectly, where you're going. When I put the presentation together, several themes did come up: education, building things, and collaboration. But I actually decided to organize it into 12 what I call actual events. And where better to start than childhood? If I grew up in the 1970s in New York City, I'm the chunk on the right. And if you're doubting the whole thing about it being the 70s, hello, poncho and wide-leg jeans. My mother made all of our clothes until I was at a really embarrassing age, including these clothes. Yes, I meant 1976. But whatever. I am again on the left. That my sister refers to that look as the get me the hell out of here look. And most of my childhood photos actually bear that look, so that's the last I will show you of them. If I were going to break my early life down into 2 major influences, I would have to say, first of all, growing up in a mixed race background was one of them. This is my father and my mother. My father was Japanese, and my mother is German. And I grew up really surrounded by the cultures of both of these nationalities. This is my great-grandparents' house. Notice the blacksmiths, the horseshoes on there. He was a blacksmith. This is in Germany. And mixed-race marriages were not well accepted in the 50s. So by the time I came along, there weren't many of me out there. So growing up in that way was really interesting. I was surrounded by the languages, too. Unfortunately, I only learned the really important words like chocolate and cat and delicious. Can you tell which one is my mother? The second major influence was growing up in my grandmother's house. My mother worked full-time, and I spent most of my time very unsupervised in this house that my grandfather had built. My grandfather was an inventor and an engineer and an architect, kind of a genius man. He built a lot of furniture that was, turns out, really stellar mid-century modern furniture, which of course I didn't appreciate until like now. He also had great tools, so I grew up with all of these tools. I still have some of them. I'm very lucky in that way. So having survived unsupervised through my childhood and through high school, which is a feat unto itself, I went directly to Syracuse University, where, if you're not familiar, Syracuse University is ginormous. It's 14 colleges and tens of thousands of students. I was truly just my social security number at this school. And I went to study architecture. Giant school, mostly covered in snow, like 10 months out of the year. It turns out it was really good that I went to a gigantic university because not only was I not an architect, I was also kind of not ready to be a student. I went to school for 3 years and changed my major 5 times. But luckily, my final major was metalsmithing. And I'm so glad, again, that I went to a large school and they had that. The head of the department at the time was Michael Jerry. And if you're not familiar with Mike's work, he was really one of the leads in the United States in the 60s of the modernist movement. He's best known for his hollowware, but interestingly, all I could find were images of his jewelry. So he was a great teacher. His second in command was Barbara Walter, and she is a mechanical genius. These are her game rings that you've probably seen, her toy rings. They all have moving parts, ball bearings, and gears that make the pieces interact with each other. I can't imagine wearing one of them and paying any attention to anything else. She's now the head of the department. Sadly, there was not a graduation cap or gown in my future at that time, and I discovered metalsmithing, said, oh, this is what I want to do, and promptly dropped out. I started making really, really ugly jewelry, which I'm not going to make you look at today, and selling it around craft fairs and so on and so forth. Thank goodness I dropped out in upstate New York, which is a great place to be a craft school dropout. A lot of people with like-minded ideas doing the same types of things, and I met a lot of really wonderful people, including, oddly enough, Tom Mann. Tom was living in New Orleans at that time, but in fact, he knew a lot of people in upstate New York and also was doing his tour marketing lectures. So I met him at one of his lectures and we became friends. I started working for him doing piecework as well as being his show assistant. I learned a lot about the business side of making from him. Through him, I met Ken Kushner. Ken was a leather worker, but he had decided to switch gears and become a metalsmith. So we were teaching ourselves to be metalsmiths at the same time. We started in a studio in a basement near a lake. We opened a small jewelry gallery that's still open in downtown Syracuse today. I made a lot of jewelry during this time, a lot of shiny, shiny gold jewelry with a lot of stones. It really made me appreciate precious metal and stones. It was the first time I worked in gold. And just the very volume of what we were making helped me really kind of hone my skills for the first time. At the same time, my friend Sydney Penner was a grad student at Syracuse University, and she had started a small sequential series of classes at BOCES. If you're from the East Coast, you might know what BOCES is. It's Board of Cooperative Educational Services. And it's basically an institution that takes advantage of the empty schools and other public institutions in the evenings for continuing ed. So she was leaving town and asked me, hey, would you like to take over teaching? And you'll notice this is a pattern for me. I didn't really think about it, but I said yes. So it's gotten me into a lot of trouble in the past. I started teaching, and again, this is kind of, I didn't even know which classroom I was going to be in every time I showed up for class. So it was one of those places where you had to build your own studio every time you showed up. So I'm like driving around with my bee tank. But the students were really hungry and were really excited about being there. I had no business teaching anybody anything. I was literally one step ahead of my students the whole time. But it was a fantastic way for me to learn. And the most important thing that I learned through this experience is that I love teaching. And really, what a privilege it is to be able to tackle or even, in some cases, master a technique for yourself. But when you get the opportunity to be there when somebody else gets it, I think that's magic. Unfortunately, I was born not only with mixed heritage, but I was born with a hole in my heart, which they didn't find until I was in college, or actually, technically, no longer in college. It's called an atrial septal defect. It's a hole between two chambers of your heart. They say that your heart is the size of your fist. The hole in my heart was the size of a quarter. So after much kind of silly debate, I did decide to have the open heart surgery. And it was a little invasive. I didn't realize, being 20, just how invasive it would be. But and the hole did actually reopen. Now it's the size of a dime. I like to joke about inflation and things like that. But I'm not planning on doing it again. It did teach me 3 really important things. The first is that I really like working through, in this case, traumatic experiences by making work. The piece on the left, unfortunately, I don't have a photo of the finished piece. It's a locket that's chased and repoussé and etched with little bubbles of water that talks about the experience of the surgery. And then on the right, that's one of my milagro pieces that I'm making. That's the heart milagro in the heart. Those are strike anywhere matches. The second thing it taught me is about the fragility of life. And I think that's a real gift to receive that early in life. I don't think many of us feel less than invincible when we're in our 20s. So that was a great thing for me. It also gave me a really bitchin' scar. But the other thing that it taught me is that I no longer wanted to live in upstate New York. So I did what any mature, rational young woman would do. I got a beer, and I threw a dart at a map. Now, everybody always asks me, I know you're all thinking, did it really land on Portland? Okay, no. The first time I threw it, it landed actually in the Pacific Ocean. So I had another beer and threw it again. And the second time I threw it, it kind of landed in Central Oregon, and I just decided, you know what, I'm quitting while on the head, going to the biggest city, and on dry land. So in 1997, I packed up my car with my grandmother's geraniums and my cat, and I drove cross country, and of course stopped at some really important sites along the way. It was a really exciting time. I was reinventing myself. I was going to a place where I literally didn't know a soul. I didn't have a job, I didn't have a place to live. And what an exciting thing to reinvent yourself and be anybody who you want to be. I landed in Portland, got a job at a coffee shop, because that's what you do when you move to Portland in your 20s, and got an apartment on Hawthorne. But I missed making. And I decided I needed to make a little jewelry bench for my little tiny apartment. So I drew up these Artimocrates designs, but I couldn't find the sketches that I had originally made. And I looked for a place to make that bench. And while I was looking, I came across Oregon College of Art and Craft, and thank goodness I did. For those of you who don't know, Oregon College of Art and Craft is a degree-granting college, and it's actually 101 years old this year. As Christine said, I started in the wood studio, and I walked in and showed my first instructor my pretty little sketches and said, hey, I want to make this. And he said, sure, no problem, you can make that. But first, you have to take this hand tools class. So I said, all right, fine. Of course, the second class, I come to that and say, okay, now it's the time, right? And he said, first you have to take this machine tools class. So I'm jumping through these hoops. You see where this is going. I started making, again, kind of funky furniture, and was really enjoying it, actually. Thought, okay, maybe I'm a woodworker. Until I needed a hinge for one of my pieces, and I wandered down to the metal studio. And I walked inside, and there are all these shiny hammers hanging up. And there are all these people working on things like 2 inches away from their face. And the tink, 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 tink in the background, and that smell. You know that smell that only Metal Studios has? Yeah, like Kristin said, I was hooked. I was powerless. And I applied and got into the degree program. Except this time I was ready for college. I was hungry for every piece of information that was given to me. Every assignment was like this new toy to play with. And it was a really fantastic time to be a student there. It was, most of the students were like me. They had been through college before. Some of them had even been through a whole career, and they decided that they wanted to be here. So the bar was really high, and it was just a really exciting time. Even the kind of funny assignments, Kristin, you remember this one? Were really fun to figure out. And raising, I was introduced to raising for the first time, which I still think is just a trip. This is a raised and altered sterling silver cup, about 4 inches tall, with an acrylic handle. And even though most of the techniques I was learning, I was really just learning to do in different ways, because every time you take a class with a different teacher, you're learning something slightly different. But I wasn't really learning technique so much as I was learning to work with concept for the first time. And I was learning to have critical discourse about the work I was making and about the work that all the other students were making. And I think that's the real gift of a degree-granting institution and being enrolled in a program. And I so appreciated that. Hydraulic formed bead, altered. This piece, everybody always thinks it's about painful shoes, so I just want to correct the record here. It's a brooch, which is way too heavy, and that's kind of one of my trademarks. But it is based on Milan Kundera's Unbearable Lightness of Being. I know, you'd never guess. But in the book, if any of you have read it, the main character, Franz, is his father leaves him when he's very young. And his mother carried on as though nothing had happened, very impressively, until one day they were going into town, and he looked down and noticed that she had put on a pair of mismatched shoes. And he said right then is when he learned the meaning of the word suffer. And I thought that was beautiful. So I made this spiky little brooch. It's Cocobolo sterling, electroformed copper, and a bunch of other stuff. The teapot. Oregon College of Art and Craft is the only degree-granting institution in the United States that still requires you, thank you very much, Kristin, to create a raised sterling teapot as part of its curriculum. I was the only one that finished during my year. It's a rigorous thing. This teapot had more than 100 joints. It took me 9 months to make, but dang it, I finished it. This is called Turf. It's sterling, maple, and hair. And if you open it when it's empty, inside it says drink more tea. And it's now in the Sonny and Gloria Cam Artful Teapot collection, I'm happy to say. It has a good home. The other thing that Oregon College of Art and Craft requires is a master's-like thesis year, which was, again, something I was really ready to sink my teeth into. And when searching for a project that I wanted to pursue for an entire year, I thought of this piece, which is called Bend Your Fingers. It's from one of the first classes I took at OCAC, where we had to make a relic ring and a reliquary for it to live on. So the ring is the part with the gun sight and the piano key, and then the reliquary is the hand. And this piece happens to be about my relationship, or lack thereof, with my father. And every time I showed it publicly, people would come up to me who I did not know and tell me really personal stuff about their relationships with their fathers, totally unprovoked. And I thought, wow, this is a powerful topic. So that's what I decided to explore during my thesis year. For the first half of my thesis year, I did mail art, M-A-I-L, and I had 185 participants or collaborators on this project, all over the world, all women in this case. I had to narrow it by something. And I shared a story about my relationship with my father with them and asked them to share one in return. Then I shared an image of my relationship with my father, asked them to do the same. And then an object, and I asked them to either take an image of it or describe it or send it to me. And in retrospect, don't ask people to send you stuff, especially not 185 people. I have a lot of stuff from this. But it was good stuff. The materials that I got became both the written materials and the actual objects were the materials that I decided to use, the raw materials for the finished work, which was the second half of my thesis year, the made art part. And at this point, I felt so responsible from the amount of trust that all of the collaborators had given me, it was really hard for me to get started. I was stuck for a long time. Eventually, I finished 7 pieces for my thesis show, and I'm going to show you a couple of them here. You can see them all on my website. This piece is called Tears Won't Help. It's a locket brooch about 3 inches tall, and it's copper and sterling and glass and tears in that vial. And it's based on the idea that phrase, "Don't cry now, tears won't help anything." And I saw that in a lot of women's stories. Some of the women felt that was a really empowering thing. Their fathers were the source of logic and reason in their lives. Their fathers helped them learn to make decisions and weigh pros and cons. And some of them felt like they really were squashed by that. They couldn't reveal any emotion. So the idea here is you can't open the locket until you unscrew the tears and put them aside. This piece is called Since I Was 8. And it's kind of the epitome of what we all want with our relationships with our fathers. It's like daddy's little girl. And this woman told me the story of her father giving her roses on her birthday every year since she was 8 years old. And usually the number of roses that she gave were corresponded with her age. So when she was 8, she got 8, and so on and so forth. And she remembered how many she got every year, because sometimes on her 21st birthday or, sweet 16, she'd get a couple dozen. So it's a sterling silver linked necklace, kind of a lariat style. And each link represents a year of her life and has laminated rose petals riveted onto it. This piece is called Make Something of Yourself. It's a ginormous bracelet. It's turned mahogany with sterling silver tracks and then thousands of Rolodex cards. This is where the obsessive-compulsive part comes in. I was typing on each of them either a phrase that they shared with me, for example, make something of yourself, or on a more negative note sometimes. God, you can never be that. Some of them were job descriptions, and some of them were blank. And the idea was that they could remove or add anything that they wanted from these tracks. And this was a representative of the women who felt pushed academically or professionally by their fathers. Again, sometimes they were really happy about that, and sometimes not so much. As a little nod to the fact that I started in wood, I made the display cases and the dictionary stand, which I now use to house my dictionary collection. And I finally graduated. I got my degree. Only 2 of us finished in medals that year. That's Sarah Sherwood, for those of you who might know her. There wasn't much of us left. People refer to this as our Addams Family look. But we did get to finish. I come from a family of educators, and I really do believe that education is where you find it, where you make it be. And so after school, I also had, a whole another second round of student loans to pay off. And I took on a lot of jobs, including working with Tammy Dean, who's a dear friend. I actually worked with Tammy throughout the entire time I was in school as well. I started working for her shortly after I moved to Portland. I know she spoke here a number of years ago. Tammy is a meticulous craftsperson. Her work is exquisite, richly textured. She does a lot of the piercing that you can see here. That's kind of her signature. She uses brightly colored gemstones. Everything is just perfectly executed. She would kill me if she knew I'd put this photo up there. And I got to work 3 feet away from her for 8 years. The really unique thing about my relationship with Tammy is she trusted me with a lot of her business, which was a great learning experience for me. So I was her bookkeeper, I was her office manager, I was her show manager, I was her marketing person, and I was her bench jeweler. And that was just a fabulous way for me to learn and try my legs. I still do her taxes, actually. Through Tammy, I met Dave Monette. Dave is a freaky genius. He's a horn maker, and you can see these are the horns that he collaborates on with Tammy. That's Art Farmer, great legendary musician. And they're horns that are specific to the player. Wynton Marsalis has several of these personalized horns that Tammy and Dave collaborate on. Dave taught himself to make horns. In fact, makes horns that nobody's ever made before. He does a horn called a flumpet that's a cross between a flugelhorn and a trumpet. And you actually have to stand a certain way to get at least a desired sound out of these horns. So some musicians love them and some of them hate them. I became their third collaborator, making finger buttons that were custom to go with these specialized custom trumpets. And so they were lapidary and enamel. That was a lot of fun. I also worked for my friend Peggy Cochran. If you don't know Peggy's work, she's also incredibly meticulous. She's kind of the queen of modular parts. These are all cast elements that she puts together. She has a very distinct vocabulary of parts. And interestingly, aside from the fact they're both meticulous craftspeople, really, Tammy and Peggy could not work more differently. And it was great for me to work for them both at the same time because I got to broaden both my vocabulary of making and my teaching vocabulary. The more ways I know how to do something, the more ways I can find something that will work for my students. And speaking of teaching, at the same time I was also asked, and of course said yes, to being the studio manager at Mount Hood Community College. It's a great experience for me because I got to learn how to take care of a larger studio, and I got to teach during open studio times as well. While all of this work was happening for other people, my studio, I had not set foot in it since graduation. No work was made until September 11th, 2001. I know people who still refer to their hometown, the place that they grew up, as home. I never felt like I was one of those people. When I left New York City, I just said, the stork dropped me in the wrong place, and I never looked behind me. Until September 11th. I felt a kind of mix of guilt and anger and fear that I could not explain. And my friends here tried to be sympathetic, but they didn't really understand the feeling I was having. I felt like an expatriate, and my country had been bombed. You see, we New Yorkers, we have a special kind of pride. You know, we know the subways. We're tougher than you. Okay? We're from the city. And I never realized how much I identified with the symbols of the city and the city itself until September 11th. So as a way to deal with all of those feelings that I was having and work through them once again, I made a piece. This fork is called Home for the Holidays. I commuted past the Twin Towers for years, and I had never been to the top. Now when I go home for the holidays, I try to visit every one of their, so this is sterling silver, ebony, and then piano key ivory scrimshaw, which you'll see in my work a lot after this point, but this was the first time I used it. And the interesting thing about it is I worked at South Street Seaport Museum as an exhibition designer for years, and they had an amazing scrimshaw collection, and it was only blocks away from the World Trade Center. After the fork, after September 11th, all of a sudden floodgates opened, which was good because my galleries were like, hello, we're going to drop you if you don't send us new work. So these are brooches. I really love working in brooch format because I feel like it's the perfect format for storytelling. Plus, you don't have to make two of them. A lot of scrimshaw here. This piece is called Syncopation. It's a neck piece that's sterling silver. Again, the piano key ivory veneer, and then ebony and diamonds. And it's based on musical notations. My father was also a conductor, and I grew up with a lot of music. In fact, so much music that I have a song in my head literally all the time. And this piece is about having a song in your head. It's called Carrie, based on an Ani DeFranco song that was in my head for like 3 months. And you can see the lyrics written across this blackboard surface, which houses a brooch set. These are all individual brooches with different found objects in them. And the idea is when you have a song in your head, you can go to your trusty display here, pick the notes that you think make up that song, and wear that out that day. This piece is called Totem. It was for the SNAG conference, I think it was 2003 in San Francisco, Exhibition in Motion. Really fun to see your work kind of strut down a runway. Again, there's that piano key ivory scrimshaw. And I started really playing with that modernist aesthetic that I had only dabbled in before. And that started to kind of clarify itself. I made a lot of rings. I think of them as kind of stories for your fingers. Lots of different materials just playing around. They're so fast. I also was doing a lot of shows and traveling a lot. And I met a lot of people to do trades with. This was a trade with Jonathan Doolin. It's called 64 and Counting. And the brooch itself is only about 3 inches tall. And I made a little display for it as well. Mixed media, mostly sterling. Tom Mann, some of you might recognize this from his knockoff show. He got so sick of being knocked off without his permission, that he decided to have a show called The Knockoff Show and invite people to knock him off. That was also in 2003. So on the left is one of his clocks, and on the right is a brooch I made called Retrospective for Tom. And it's, again, way too big and heavy, but mixed media. It's probably about 5 inches, 6 inches tall. This is a piece that was for the show Anti-War Medals at Velvet Da Vinci. This is my medal, and at the bottom, that's a little enamel drop, and it's hollow. There's motor oil on the inside. I can't believe this was 2003, and we're still in this war. But the interesting thing was I was getting all these invitations and calls for entry, and that really kept me going. So I do best when I have a deadline. I also started collaborating during this time. This is a collaboration between furniture maker Terry Bostwick and fashion designer Suzanne Kraft. They needed me to make something really kind of audacious jewelry for their girl here. So that's a kind of breastplate out of sterling silver, enamel, ivory, and tourmaline. And on the back, it's hard to see in this photo, those are many different spiculum forms that have been enameled, cascading down her back. I also did a collaboration with my friend Brad Winter, who's an amazing metalsmith. This was the middle doll from a set of nesting dolls, if you can call them dolls. This is electroformed copper that has been enameled with sterling silver. Inside it fits a little alabaster doll, and the thing that encompasses it is made of latex. It's really creepy when it's inside there. So it turns out that working for other people all day with your hands and then going home and working on your own work all night and weekend doesn't work out so well. I developed carpal tunnel tendinitis, early onset osteoarthritis, and eventually just a whole inflammatory syndrome around that from overworking my body. My doctors told me I would no longer be able to make a living as a maker. And that was devastating for 2 reasons. A, student loans still there. And B, who was I if not a metalsmith? Luckily, somewhere during that 16-job period, I was also volunteering for SNAG as their silent auction manager. The silent auction is a component of all SNAG conferences, and volunteering allowed me to attend the conferences for free, which was great. It also allowed me to meet a lot of people, including the executive director of SNAG, Dana Singer. And Dana asked me in 2003, at the same time that I was looking for a job, if I would like to be their new conference director. They had never had a conference director before, so, I'm like, sure. And it was a great thing to be able to build all the systems that went around putting on a conference. I got to travel. I got to work with local hosts in each city. And I got to meet even more people. And most of all, I got to flex my administrative muscles for the first time, which it turned out I kind of liked. This is the group in St. Petersburg, Florida. Unfortunately, the last conference I started working on was Memphis, the 2007 conference, and it was entitled, kind of ironically, Directions Unknown. SNAG decided to bring my position in-house, and the contractor position ended. So once again, I was left scrambling for a job. Using my patented just say yes method, I became the lead and, in fact, only armaturist for Bent Image Labs, which is a small stop-motion animation, actually not just stop-motion, but an animation studio in Portland. And if you think you might not know what stop-motion is, you do. These are the beloved Rankin Bass holiday specials, of course, very near and dear to my heart. More recently, you've probably seen Tim Burton's Nightmare Before Christmas and Corpse Bride. And, of course, Davy and Goliath. The way that stop motion works, sorry for the low res on this image, the way that stop motion works is a puppet that has an armature inside it, which is basically the skeleton, is used by an animator to move incrementally, taking several frames of film, for lack of better terminology, and then they put those frames together, and it works like a flip book to produce kind of lifelike action, or at least that's the goal. So I was in charge of making those skeletons. There are a lot of other people involved in many different ways to make stop motion happen, and it takes quite a bit of time to even produce one 30-second commercial spot. The puppet makers, there are people who only make wigs for the puppets, people who do sets. It's pretty extraordinary, the amount of talent that goes in, and the really wacky artists that work for these industries. This is one of the armatures that I worked on. It's really fun. Nobody was there to teach me how to do any of this. So I was figuring it all out on my own. I was like doing things like this, going, okay, if your hip moves like this, where do I put the ball and socket joint to make it happen? And it was a really fun thing to learn. It was the wackiest job I've ever had, because I'd be sitting there soldering and somebody'd be walking by with a tray of heads. Really creative people, kind of high stress, but also really high energy. I learned some good fly tying tips to figure out how to make hands. And it was stainless steel and brass, and nobody cared if there were solder seams showing, and it was really hard not to clean up those solder seams. But eventually, this is one of the pieces that I worked on, and I'm going to show it to you, but I just want to say the disclaimer that the animators don't tell the armaturist anything about what's going to happen in the action, so just know that it's nothing to do with this.
This innocent girl called Callista, who the village men thought of as a sister,
Starts off.
went into the moonlight for a stroll in search of dates to place in a bowl. Among black roses, a strange fruit she found, and when she touched it, her sexuality was unbound. For it wasn't a date, but a black bar for the skin, and in a dark night, Callista's lust would begin. Now the sweet little animals have nasty thoughts in their heads. Deer, bear, and rodents all Callista on their beds. The men in town still view her as a sister, as someone else's sister, mister. She no longer collects dates on the ground, but now collects dates with men all the time. And when she gets weary, she throws them away. And that's how this town lost its innocence that day. This isn't a fairy tale from a dusty old text, but rather a volume full of forbidden secrets and sex.
I'm really glad you guys are laughing. I was like, should I show that? You know, I probably should have been suspicious when the animator came to me and said, yeah, just make sure that her hips really move. Working in animation was a lot of fun, a great learning experience, but unfortunately the job wasn't very steady. When they had a job, they wanted me to work 18-hour days, and when they were done with that job, they'd lay me off. So again, student loans, mortgage, I went looking for another job. Luckily, I was a member and longtime supporter of what is now called Museum of Contemporary Craft, and landed the job of gallery director at a really exciting time in their development. For those of you who might not know contemporary crafts, it started in 1937. It's actually one of Portland's oldest arts institutions, and it was started by a group of ladies led by Lydia Herrick Hodge. And in 1937, it started as the Oregon Ceramic Guild. But in 1960, they managed to get a plot of 4 lots of land in southwest Portland in the Blair Hill neighborhood. And using donated materials and WPA funds, they built Contemporary Crafts Gallery. There they showed work of regional artists, they sold it, and they really, most importantly, elevated the public's view of what craft is. The only problem with that old location is that it was in southwest Portland, and it was one of Portland's best-kept secrets. We would have people come in every day and say, I've lived here my whole life, and I didn't know you were here. So in 2005, the executive director, David Cohen, and the board went in search of a new location for their space, and they came up with this space right here. Sorry, my laser pointer is down there somewhere. And essentially decided to buy the building as part of a condo association. And the building had its own lovely history as well. It was a used car dealership in the 50s and went through a whole host of other incarnations between that time and when we bought it. We bought it with 4 other galleries and an architecture firm, completely gutted it. So we were working with the architects on every detail, right down to the light switches, and it was really fun to have that much say in what the new museum was going to look like. Like any construction project, though, you know, the end date for the construction was kind of a moving target, And unfortunately, the opening date, not so much of a moving target. In fact, it had been publicized nationwide for like a year. So we had at the end a week to install everything without the contractors and get ready for our grand opening on July 22nd, 2007. And we did it. So this is the new location on the corners of Northwest 8th and Davis on the North Park blocks. If you haven't been there yet, definitely make time to come down. The new space is light-filled and it puts the contemporary in contemporary craft. And now people can discover us even by accident, which is a wonderful thing. This is a view of the gallery with the gate closed. The gallery at Museum of Contemporary Craft is the retail area of the museum. That was what I was in charge of. And of course, all of the new exhibition space, it's more than doubled in size. The exhibition we opened with was Craft in America, and hopefully some of you at least saw the PBS series that corresponded with this traveling show if you didn't get to see the show in person. It's a great survey of American craft, and it really showed off our new space. We had a lot of programming that went with it as well. And the gallery, I think, the thing I'm most proud of is that it really became an integral part of the programming of the museum. It let people understand craft in a different way than the rest of the programs of the museum. It let people touch it and try it on and take it home, hopefully. So we were also supporting the artists, which is very important to me. And of course, I loved curating the jewelry part of the gallery. Speaking of jewelry, one of the shows that we had, one of the exhibitions that we had before I left was at the beginning of 2008. And it was the brainchild of Rebecca Shear, who's in our audience. Here she is with her husband, Andrew. And it was called Touching Warms the Art. So hopefully some of you got to see this show. It was a play on words for touching harms the art, or, please do not touch. Because when we make jewelry, most of us who make art jewelry, it's strange to think that when we show it, it's shown under a glass vitrine or locked away in a way that the viewer cannot become the wearer, and therefore may not even be able to understand the concept behind the piece. So this show is a show where all of the work was touchable and try-onable. And many people touched and tried on. There's Joe, he's here today, Amico, who works for Harriet. And Rochelle Thievis and Namita Wiggers co-curated the show with Rebecca. There was also a webcam as part of this exhibition that downloaded directly to Flickr, and I have to admit that the staff had a little too much fun with that. This is the team of directors that brought the new museum into being, and I'm so honored that I got to be a part of this group of visionaries that made the museum happen. It was a really formative time to be involved with the museum. And this is my staff at the museum, who I really wanted to honor here today because they are the most devoted group of people I have ever had the opportunity to work with. But as Christine said, in January of this year, OCAC lured me back to academia, which is really where a great chunk of my heart lies. They had obviously gone through a big rebranding process as well. And they hired me to be their extension program director. Now, if you're like me, you're like, what is an extension program director? And Christine named a lot of the things that I cover in the extension programs. It's kind of everything but the BFA. And the thing that's really interesting, the reason that I took the job is because I saw it as an opportunity to really unite the different nonprofit arts organizations in Portland and make the Pacific Northwest a destination for craft. Sounds a little like a lot to chew, right? But I'm definitely working on it. It's also an exciting time to be at the college because we just broke ground on the first phase of our massive campus expansion. And just so you know, when you're looking at this model, the chipboard buildings that are depicted here are existing buildings, and all the balsa is new construction. The first building we're working on is this one, which is the drawing, painting, and photography building, and also thesis and foundations. It's kind of like the everything building. It is 17,000 square feet. And I don't know about you, but my house is like, 1,300 tops. So that's a lot of space, and it's really going to free up space. We're kind of bursting at the seams in all of our studios, so that we're excited to have this happen. Still only a third the size of Bill Gates' house. And I thought you might like to also know, in the second phase, we will be adding an addition to the metal studio. Again, chipboard existing, balsa, new construction. Check that out. Yeah. So come take classes and workshops at our giant new facility. Apparently, I only like to work for institutions that are under construction. Luckily, this one will be under construction for a while, so at least I can stay still for a while. This is right outside my office. For those of you who have gone over to the dark side, like I have, to arts administration full-time, or anything full-time that's not making, you know how hard it is to get inspired enough to go back into the studio. And so I thought I'd share a couple of ways that I stay inspired. The first way is continuing to teach. I still teach whenever I can. I teach workshops all over the country, teach classes in Portland, and really get so much inspiration and energy from all of my students. I also, in 2004, started to develop and grow a program at Multnomah Arts Center, a program of consecutive metalsmithing classes. They're very affordable because they're through Portland Parks and Recreation. Started out with all my tools, so you can actually see my name on most of the tools here, and built the benches with a friend. And now our wonderful Lori Hall, I'm so happy to say, teaches in my program, Lori. And we're growing it together now. It's a great team of teachers. I also like to go to Haystack whenever possible. The first time I went, I was a work-study student for Bob Ebbendorf. Then I was an assistant to Marcia. Everybody knows Marcia McDonald. And actually, next year I get to go and teach. So I feel like I'm graduating finally. I'll be teaching a class in collaborations. And I'll be at Penland in 2010, which is also exciting. Really surrounding myself with creative people is the way that I find best to stay inspired. And I am so blessed to be surrounded by a community of incredibly creative and caring people. Here are just a few of them. Travel is also incredibly inspiring to me. And I didn't realize, again, until I was putting together this presentation, how directly the places that I visit influence my work. This is the Guggenheim on the left with the Calder Mobile. That's a brooch I made called I-29, sterling silver, a piano key ivory, and a bingo piece, and it's about 3 inches tall. If any of you have been to Italy recently, everything is under construction there, too. And they do this really bizarre thing where they have scaffolds up in front of all the buildings, but they screen print images of the building that's underneath and hang it on the scaffold like nothing's going on there, everything's fine. And like some of them even have advertisements on it. It's just the most bizarre thing, and I thought it was great. And I came home and started making these cozy pieces, just kind of to protect and also hide, but also kind of embellish my work. This is Kinkakuji Temple in Kyoto, Japan, and the bottom piece is carved antler. It's a brooch as well. Sterling silver, electroformed copper that's been gold-plated, and there's a little peridot at the bottom. This is a wall-mounted brooch series, again with the chalkboard. They're enamel brooches that each come off. You can wear them individually or as a group. And it's called migration, and they remind me of the soul migration that is kind of symbolized by the cairn that's on Enoshima Island in Japan. I literally almost stumbled upon the festival of Corpus Domini in Monterosso, Italy, and it reminded me of my thesis work and then a subsequent production line in rose petals. This is called Lunar Calendar, and it's a neck piece also with piano key ivory, gold, diamonds, and pearls, and inspired by, there's a moon viewing autumnal festival in Japan that I just find really fascinating. They believe there's a rabbit in the moon, not a man. I find the textures in nature really inspiring, as probably many of you do, but I really find it inspiring to see the marks we leave on nature. It's amazing to me what the things that people write on. You can see the bamboo texture is kind of directly related to this series of limited production rings in 18 karat gold, 14 karat palladium white gold, and mixed colored diamonds. I also like to see the marks that nature leaves on things we leave behind. I'm an avid kayaker, and this is one of the buildings I saw just recently in Scappoose Bay, and that's a brooch called Counting. Sterling silver, it's again, everything I make is apparently 3 inches tall, and steel stitches that I've let kind of rust into a felt background. It's wool felt. Andy Goldsworthy work, concentric circles. I'm really fascinated by concentric circles and the hypnotic quality of them. These are sterling silver links with diamonds. I also really love horsehair raku on porcelain, and thought, could I do that in enamel Turns out you can. Your studio will stink for a really long time. And that is a piece called Timeline. It's also a brooch, and I used my own hair. I always think of hair as being kind of the history of your life that you're carrying around on top of your head. And those are the Sierra Nevadas, my color palette. And traditional blacksmithing always plays a role. I like to forge things. I like the tensile strength that you can kind of visually feel when you see something that's been forged. And again, Calder's work, very inspirational. That's a piece called Astro. I think it was on the postcard. And another Calder piece, I like the idea of framing a view. This is a piece that's in public art in upstate New York. So this ring has a little private view that only the wearer can see. My most recent body of work is called Unfinished, Damaged, and Broken. And its inspiration came when I was caring for my mother recently after her heart attack and subsequent open heart surgery. I lived with her for 3 months while she was ailing. And she still has the kitchen table that I grew up with. And it bears the marks of 3 children learning how to write and sew and, unfortunately, use a hammer. And it's a little worse for the wearer. It's a little wobbly. And she has this method of shimming little pieces of cardboard underneath one of the legs so it doesn't wobble. And I came down the stairs one day, and, she's ill. She's crawling around on the floor, searching for one of the pieces of cardboard so she could stick it back in. And I said, "Ma, what are you doing?" And she said, "Don't worry, I do this every couple of days." Okay. And it struck me as so bizarre that this ritual of fixing this thing over and over and over again, it never occurred to her to either A, fix the thing for real, or B, get a new one. She was too attached to it. And I really got to thinking about all the different ways that we make those accommodations in our lives for objects, for people who are maybe not functioning in our lives the way that they once were or that we hoped they would. And yet we form ourselves into some way to be able to live with them continually. These broken plates are the first in this series. I, for some reason, have been obsessively collecting broken plates for a long time, and it took me a long time to know what to do with them. I've been stitching them back together and decorating them, embellishing them. Interestingly, when I show this work, people rarely notice that they're cracked, which I think is really interesting. All they see is the embellishment. And again, I think that's a great metaphor for how we all walk through life. People don't notice our cracks most of the time. We're hyper aware of them. But most of the time, people don't even know that there are chunks of you missing. I'm really enjoying this body of work. So, this last part, I really debated whether or not to share with you here today. But I decided it has become such a big part of my life, and in fact, has really changed the way that I work and live, and I decided it would be odd for me not to include it. So in May of this year, I was diagnosed with a very aggressive form of cervical cancer, and I've been dealing with it ever since. And for those of you who may have been through cancer or know a friend or loved one who's been through it, you probably heard the word gratitude attached to cancer. And when I've heard that in the past, I was like, yeah, right, good for you to stay positive, but yeah, sure, you're totally grateful. It turns out, I'm here to tell you, it's true. After, the panic goes away, the first thing I felt was an overwhelming feeling of gratitude. And one of the things I am most grateful for in my life is the friendship of Greg Wilbur. If you don't know Greg by his face, he's here today. You probably know his exquisite metalwork. He is a metal artist that works primarily and actually exclusively in raising, and he has taken the art form to new heights. He's also incredibly humble about it. The other thing that Greg is that you probably don't know is he's a connector of people. He's a person who generously gives of himself to make opportunities happen for people that he sees and comes into contact with. He's a hub person. And this year he gave me the opportunity to attend the Emma International Collaboration. The Emma Collaboration is an event that happens once every 2 years in the woods of Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. I finally learned how to say that right. And 100 artists are invited from all over the world, all different media. We make stuff together in the woods for a week. And then the work is auctioned off at the end of that week, and the money that's raised becomes the seed money for the next event. So it's held at Ness Creek, which is a concert venue. It used to be held at Emma Lake, which is why the name is Emma. It's a concert venue. There are no tools there. So the first event that we do, the first collaboration, is to build the studios together. People show up with truckloads of giant machinery, little tiny tools, and of course, anything we can get through customs. So basically, our metal studio was whatever Greg and I could fit in our 50-pound allowance of our suitcases that didn't look too much like a weapon. This is the metal studio that we set up. It's the ticket booth at the concert venue, which is kind of funny. And Emma is just a magical experience. There's woodworking, glass, a blacksmith shop, fully equipped, really. And there was surface design. There was also fibers. I don't have any pictures of that. The thing that's really great about this environment is that you probably don't have the tool that you would normally reach for in your studio with you. And you definitely don't have the material that you would normally use. And so there's a sense of discomfort, and I think a lot of growth can happen there. So it's a great place to work and grow and play. Speaking of play, a lot of the raw materials we use are things that are donated, it's kind of the stuff pile. So a lot of the work that comes out is sometimes a little wacky. But there are a lot of big personalities there, a lot of big names. Arthur Ganson, Bobby Hansen, Kim Kelser, thank you. And of course, Greg, sorry, I love that picture. But interestingly, there are no egos here. People leave their egos at the door, if there were doors. And it's really an extraordinary place. Everybody's an equal at Emma. A lot of teaching happens at Emma in formal and informal ways, and that's really cool to watch happen. People are doing demos for each other or just showing each other one-on-one. And I just want to say very clearly, ladies and gentlemen, the future of education is collaboration. I'm going to say it again because I think it's incredibly important. The future of education is collaboration. And Emma is a great testament to that. But I see it happening at OCAC. I see it happening with artists all over. They're thinking about what they have and how it can benefit other artists and vice versa. And I think that's the future. The finished work tent starts out empty, but these are like the hardest working people I've ever seen. So 100 artists, we made 320 finished pieces this year. It was a little crazy. And I'm going to show you a couple of the finished pieces. This is a collaboration between Sylvie Rosenthal, who actually has a piece in the Faceri show right now, and Bobby Hansen. It's a little mask. One eye shows through one side, and the other side has a little dial that spins and says little phrases like, "How do you like your eggs?" These are some of the pieces I worked on, a brooch with a glass piece and a wood piece. This is a painting that was done by Rachel Bliss that had cracked, and she saw one of my plates and said, "Would you sew this back together?" And then a brooch that was made with Lindsay Embry as well. Some of the collaborative pieces are collaborations like this, where everybody makes one of something. So everybody made a feather to go into this piece, and it's auctioned off as one item. Or we're given kind of a loose assignment. This was the assignment of make a utensil, and as you can see, everybody kind of interpreted it their own way. There's giant work, or large-scale work, and sometimes very heavy work. This is all furniture. That bench right over there is on pistons, so it kind of bounces up and down. And there's tiny work. The piece on the right on this slide is actually a cloning kit. It has a little piece of hair from everybody who was attending, so we can recreate Emma 08 anytime we want, or anytime the technology catches up. You know, no matter what name tag I'm wearing, this is my Emma name tag. They kind of put whatever they want on it. I got lucky, I guess. No matter what name tag I'm wearing or what position I'm in, I always introduce myself as a metalsmith, because this is really where my heart lies. And I have to thank you all for allowing me to put together this presentation. It has been an amazing journey of self-discovery and reflection. And I honestly think all of you should go home and do it tomorrow. Every couple of years, it was a really fantastic experience for me. So save your name tags. And until next time, may all of your events be joyful ones. Thank you.